Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video I'm going to be talking about sort of a suggestion that I have for Gaijin Entertainment, just generally the War Thunder team, for something that for me personally I would like to see added to the game. This being a sort of better, more practical tier 5 premium than the Centurion AVRE for the British Ground Forces tech tree. Now, the AVRE is a fun vehicle, you can do very well in it, but from my personal experience with the vehicle, it's not the best thing for constant grinding to try to get, for example, the next vehicles along the tree. So what I would like to suggest is a vehicle that would be an equivalent to, for example, the XM1, T55AM, the Leopard 1 L44, those sort of things, for the British tech tree. Now, I have been considering many options for this role, and I think I have narrowed it down. Now, some of the options I thought of ranged from the British-built MBT-80, the Australian Leopard 1 tanks, which of course would be a Commonwealth vehicle, so that could be added to the British tech tree. But the vehicle I've settled on is something that I personally think would be a rather well-performing vehicle, as well as being quite unique in both design and sort of the country it's from compared to how many tanks from that country are in the game. And this is the Merkava Mk1. Now you may be thinking, come on Bacon, the Merkava Mk1 is Israeli. What has that got to do with the British tech tree? How could that fit in? Well, I did do a lot of research, and it turns out the Merkava Mk1 features quite a few components actually from British tanks. For example, the suspension system, the wheels, the tracks are all the same design as from the Centurion. The Israelis use that as a general chassis sort of design that they would then build the Merkava off of. That is for the Merkava Mk1. I didn't look into the later variants as I thought they would be a bit too high performing to be a tier 5 premium. But still, a lot of components from a British tank. The gun is a licensed built copy of the L7, I believe, which is a 105mm British cannon, and that's what's mounted on the Merkava Mk1. Now we'll just go through some basic stats of this vehicle, and then I'll explain more how I think this could perform and how it could be implemented into the game. Now this tank, the Merkava Mk1, entered service in 1978, so it's not too far off being equivalent to other tier 5 premiums entry dates into service, such as the XM1, which of course didn't go into service but was only a prototype, the T55AM and the Leopard 1 L44. In terms of crew members, it has a 4-person crew, which means it's got pretty decent survivability. You can most likely, if this was in the game, lose half of your crew and still be able to operate the tank, which is always a good thing. Now, the weight of this vehicle, it weighs 60 tons, so it's not exactly on the light side, but it is fairly well armoured, which sort of explains that weight. But it is a very sort of, it's not a big tank, it's fairly small, but it's got a lot of stuff packed in there into a very small area. Now, with the length of the tank, the hull is 7.45 meters, so it's fairly decently sized, and it's got a width of 3.7, so it's a pretty decent tank, and it has got a lot of armor, as I said before. Now, the main gun is a 105mm rifled cannon, which, as I said, was a license-built version of the British L7 105mm cannon. In terms of machine guns, you actually have 3 7.62mm machine guns, which is pretty interesting. One is mounted coaxially, and then you have the 2 other guns, one of which is on top of the commander's hatch, and the other of which I believe is on top of the loader's hatch. So effectively you have one in the turret, which is obviously next to the gun, and then you have 2 others on top of the tank. They are 7.62, so at a higher tier, it's likely those guns aren't actually going to be that effective. But of course, machine guns can be useful for example, distracting your enemy, or just, I don't know, just randomly trying to get hits on stuff, possibly hitting aircraft as well. Now, the elevation of the gun is actually incredibly good. You have got 7.5 degrees of depression, which isn't great, but if you look at pictures of the tank, as you can see in the background now, the chassis, it's fairly close to the gun, and it, of course, since the turret isn't near the front, it's more near the back, there's a lot more stuff that the gun has to sort of go down on top of, so it's not going to be able to go down as much, but it is still a decent amount of depression, and looking at the general design of this tank, I think using it as a hull down tank would be a very good idea. Now, you do also have plus 20 degrees of gun sort of rise, which is very good. Can be useful for shooting at aircraft, possibly, if you decide that's what you want to do. Looking into the ammunition is rather interesting. Now, this tank can carry 62 rounds overall for the main cannon, and then it can also carry 10,000 rounds overall for the 3 machine guns. Of course, I think that's just generally in storage and they can be reloaded. Obviously, in the game, it's highly likely that it'll just be that single reload of the gun, and then once that is out. As far as I know, I think, though, they can reload for most of the vehicles in the game. Now, the engine is actually a AVDS 1796A diesel engine, which produces 908 horsepower. Now, it's a heavy tank. That's not a huge amount of horsepower, but it does say that, of course, when this was originally designed by the Israeli Defense Forces, for the Israeli Defense Forces, the main emphasis of the design was not exactly speed and mobility, but more crew protection. In a way, it is like the Challenger design when that was originally designed, not exactly hugely focusing on the sort of mobility and speed of the tank, but mostly keeping the crew safe so you can keep the tank going for longer, because it's all good and well having a fast tank, for example, the Ru 251, but if your crew's killed, you're obviously not going to be able to use the tank. So I think focusing on armor protection more is definitely a very good idea when designing a tank. Now, moving on to the next point, the maximum road speed. This thing can reach 46 kilometers per hour, which it's not a bad speed compared to some other tanks. In my opinion, I think the speed and mobility wouldn't be that far off of the premium Leopard 1. It's not as fast as some of the other tanks like the XM1 and possibly stuff like the, possibly stuff like the Leopard 2, those sort of things that it would face. But it's got good armor. It's a bit slower, but it can still be used fairly effectively if you know what you're doing. Now, I did also find some stats on the sort of maneuverability of the vehicle and how you can use this. Now, in terms of, I found a few interesting things. For example, going over a trench. This vehicle can go over a trench of a maximum width of 3 meters, which may not be so useful knowing for that in-game, but, you know, it's just a nifty little fact there. As well as going up gradients of 60 degrees and side slopes of 40 degrees, or 40% and 60%. But yeah, that's rather interesting there. Now, I was going to say I was going to implement this into the game. Now, obviously, I've made it quite clear I would like this to be on the British tech tree. Now, the main reason for that, as I said before, is that the Merkava was a significant improvement over the previous tank that the Israeli Defense Forces had as their sort of main tank, which was the Centurion. And a lot of the components and, for example, the gun, the suspension system, the tracks, were all carried over to the Merkava. So, in a way, it has got a lot of British designed components on it. You could compare that to the Mk1, which obviously has an American tank chassis and turret and has been fitted with ERA and a few other things. This is slightly different. This is more of an Israeli home-built tank, but due to the British components being in there, I feel like this could be a good suit for the British tech tree, which, you know, would, I think, be pretty cool. Now, this tank's gun had a few nice little options for shells. It could fire APDS, heat, HESH, and also phosphorus shells, which most likely wouldn't be added into the game, as a lot of the tanks in the game could use phosphorus shells, and they're not in the game at the moment. There's no actual practical use for them. But it could also use APFSDS, so you got your high-pen APFSDS. Now, it says heat shells in the research that I did. I can't tell if that's heat FS or another type of heat shells. I would presume it is from a tank made in the late 1970s. I would presume it's heat FS. The HESH shells are likely going to be the same ones used on the standard British version of the L7 cannon. Similar rounds to those used on the Vickers MBT, those sort of things. Those kind of rounds are likely what we're going to be seeing. The APFSDS, I'm not sure what exact round that would be, but as per usual, APFSDS does tend to be one of the best penning shells on a shell lineup, and APDS is a kind of shell that I don't think you're going to be using that much if it was an option. Now, let's talk quickly about the protection of the vehicle, and more importantly, the driver. Now, the engine obviously is at the front of the tank, because otherwise it would be underneath the turret, and where would the crew go? But then the driver is actually seated on the left of the engine. And if you look at armor diagrams of this vehicle, the armor is far heavier in front of that driver seated portion of the vehicle. So the driver does get some extra protection. And of course, the engine on one side will possibly help with parts of shells coming through, stopping them before the driver gets killed. But one interesting thing about this vehicle is that the driver's compartment is isolated from the rest of the crew by an armor-plated wall. Now, what that makes me think is, will you be able, for example, your driver's knocked out, will they do it so that the driver can just be replaced after the driver replenishment's ticked over? Because if he's in a separate compartment, will it work that way? Now, I think there are other tanks that do have the driver in a separate compartment and it works normally, but it is an interesting thing to discuss. So let me know in the comments what you think of that, with the driver being in a separate compartment. How will the driver replenishment work if he's killed? Now, in terms of what position this would be at, I think a 9.0 rating would suit this vehicle fairly well. It's not exactly as fast as most of the tanks it will be facing, but it's got a decent gun and decent shells, and the gun, I think, really is the thing that would let it down the most. That might lead it to being like an 8.3 or an 8.7, just due to this gun, which is also featured on tanks like the Centurion Mk1 or the Vickers MBT, so obviously it's not going to be the most effective gun, but Gaijin might decide to give it updated shells due to the tank being made later than those other MBTs, which would possibly help with its rating. And the armor itself is a pretty interesting thing. It's not a huge amount of armor. I found various sources claiming different types of armor. One place said that it just had steel spaced armor. A few places said composite. I can't really find an exact source saying what that is, but I feel like the armor would be fine anyway. For example, the Leopard 1L44, that's not actually got any, if much, composite armor. That doesn't have the best protection, but you can still do fine in that vehicle if you play it a bit sneaky and can use the gun from long distance. This gun definitely will be a long distance gun. At least that's how I use tanks like the Centurion Mk1 and the Vickers MBT, especially the MB2 due to the light armor, but this gun can be very good at long range. It is worth noting that the APFSDS shell that can be used is the Israeli M111 shell, which rather interesting, can pen up to 150mm of rolled homogeneous armor at an angle of 60 degrees, so that's not actually too bad. One other thing to note is that the Merkava Mk1 does also have a digital computer and laser rangefinder, so that would obviously be in game. The laser rangefinder is a modification on some of the higher MBTs, so that would most likely be there as a, of course, if it's a premium, a pre-researched modification. Now, I was looking through the forums before making this video at various other suggestions for the Merkava Mk1, and one thing I did actually see was that someone said it could be an event vehicle. I don't think you should do that. I think this could be a very good British premium to really have people using it as a grinding vehicle. You use this vehicle to grind things. I think the previous vehicles that I mentioned as possibilities, such as the MBT-80, I think that should be a tech tree vehicle despite it only being a prototype. There are other British vehicles, of course, like the Vickers MBT Mk7, which I think could be very good after the Challenger, but that's a conversation for another video. So let me know in the comments what you thought of this general video. What did you think of the suggestion of the Merkava Mk1 as a British premium? Do you think it's a good idea, a bad idea? Are you undecided? Do let me know in the comments. But anyway, thanks a lot for watching the video. If you did enjoy, please consider leaving a like, maybe even subscribe to the channel. If you do, that would be very much appreciated. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.